welcome Geetha to Ahimsa Conversations. Thank you so much for making time. So what is your earliest memory of either the practice or the experience of Ahimsa?
Before practice, I think for me, my earliest memory of hearing about Ahimsa as we understand it now is in the form of a story that my mother told me. I must have been 6 or 7, and one of the things I enjoyed a great deal was listening to stories of how it was when my mother was a little girl. So one of the stories that she told me was of her baby brother who had since passed on, that he was a very unusual child. His name was Srinivas and they used to call him Chinu. And she said, now it seems that he was never really meant to be part of this world because he had such a large heart. And I didn't quite understand what she meant at that time. But I do remember very vividly how she explained this idea of someone having a large heart, that he would sort of hold back his elder sisters, including my mother, by saying, don't go there. There's a lot of ants there. If you go there, you'll crush them to death. So he had this great compassion for anything that moved and breathed. And he would constantly tell his elder sisters that they ought to be careful, that they don't sit somewhere because it would harm some creature that was too small for anyone's notice, except perhaps for him. And I remember this left a huge impression on me because it seemed very mythical that somebody could be so mindful of life and so on. But it was a favorite childhood story. So if you were to ask me about my earliest memories of coming in contact with the idea of Ahimsa, that would be it. The practice, it's a little harder for me to sort of identify any one instance or one incident, so to speak. But I do remember that I had gone to a Christian friend's household, and the course of a conversation about what do you do if someone upsets you? Do you go and complain? Or do you sort of, if you're beaten up on the playground, what do you do? I must have been 11 or 12 or maybe even older, I'm not sure. And I remember my friend's uncle or someone who was a pastor in a church say that, but you must remember what Jesus said, show the other cheek. And I said, but that'll hurt. He said that might hurt, but it also shows the world that you're ready to face up to injustice. Again, I'm not sure I understood everything, but there it was. So I guess that would be my earliest memories of both the idea of Ahimsa and perhaps what a practice of that would entail for a child.
And as a grown-up, when you became very politically engaged and involved in the struggles for justice, how did you, in your adult self, see the question of violence and non-violence?
I think for me, the most important shaping experience of my understanding of violence was really the work that we did in our feminist group in Chennai, because I think it brought us face to face with an aspect of everyday violence, because we were a support group for women who faced domestic violence. And it made me understand something about violence, that there is no way one can negotiate with violence through violence. Because I think there was something so toxic about how violence was often mixed up with notions of care, of protection, of actually loving someone, therefore wanting to hurt them. The whole messed up relationship between possession, affection, love, violence, that it became very clear to me and many of us that we wish to address violence in a productive, good sense. There's no point in sort of either being vengeful. There was no point even saying that punitive justice is what we need. We need justice, certainly. But should it be punitive in instances like this? We weren't sure. Because we understood that violence also was habit. Violence was also something you had normalized in your dealings with the world. Violence was something that had to do with your sense of self, in as much as it had to do with how you wish to hurt someone else. So I think all of these made it very evident that the practice of violence is something that cannot be countered through any form of violence, including, what some feminists today call carceral justice. I mean, that's a whole other area of thought, but I've often sort of wondered what it means to put someone in prison for a crime and whether that really transforms a person or it doesn't. So I think in that connection, for me, violence has become something that you can only negotiate with through argument, through reason, through recourse to law, through forms of justice, but certainly not through action that could be construed as counter violence or punitive violence.
Yeah. Geetha, to what extent did your interest in and your enormous scholarship on Ambedkar play a role in this? Because I am hoping that you can kind of walk us through an understanding of Baba Sahab's, firstly, understanding of structural violence and his own understanding of nonviolence.
That's a question for which I may have to go back a little bit before I start with Ambedkar. I think one of the things that I sort of came to understand was somewhere in the 1990s, during the Mandal Masjid years, between the early 1990s, when India was faced with this tremendous crisis in terms of how are we to hold together as a nation if we divide ourselves on the basis of religion and if we do not address caste-based inequality. So at that time, I was researching on the Tamil anti-caste movements in Tamil Nadu in southern India, and the thought of Ramasamy Periyar, who was a very important leader from the 1920s onwards, and who wrote and spoke a great deal in public about fighting caste, fighting the hegemony of the dominant caste, particularly the Brahmins. And what struck me was his language was very forceful, he was very satiric, he was very critical, but he was committed to nonviolence. He didn't think that you could actually address the question of birth-based inequality as it exists in India through any form of violence. And I wondered what that could mean, because obviously for those who face caste-based inequalities and degradation, that experience can be very traumatic, very demeaning. So to retaliate would seem almost normal, so to speak. But here was someone who spent a great part of his 94 years fighting caste, but who saw that it was a task that had to be continued and endured over many years. So much so that towards the end of his life, when he was interviewed and asked about what did he think he had achieved in fighting caste all these years, the interviewer obviously was very convinced that he would say, we've achieved this, we've achieved that, and so on. But the dear old man said, actually I've done very little, because fighting caste is like dragging a mountain using a strand of hair. The enormous work that is required to do this, and violence certainly is not the means to achieve something that would take centuries, if not more. And not for nothing did the movement that he founded, the self-respect movement, compare their own efforts to what the Buddha did. In fact, they said that we trace ourselves back to that millennium, because that was the last time that someone took a principled stand against caste. And the Buddha, as we know, stood for Maitri, for compassion and firmness and justice, but equally for Maitri and compassion. So for me, understanding a cause, which was a very just cause, which had to do with a very sort of the constitutive inequality of the Indian social order, and someone who fought it all his life felt violence was not the means to do that. And in fact, in one meeting, I remember where his opinion had angered someone in the audience, and they threw slippers on the stage where he was seated. And his followers immediately engaged in fisticuffs, and he stopped them saying, that's not the way to do it. And what is the difference between the credibility of your cause and the non-credibility of theirs? So I think it was very important to retain that sense of civility, rationality, and decorum while fighting caste. You could be forceful in your arguments. You could even sound like you are vituperative, even hate. You might even sound that you hate something. But I'll come back to that in a minute, the relationship between hate and love, which Ambedkar talks of quite a lot. So this is the beginning of my understanding of how anti-caste movements in this country have been pacific by and large. And this is as true of Ambedkar's own forebear in Maharashtra, Mahatma Phule, who also was very committed to the path of rationality, argument. And interestingly, the organization he founded was called the Satya Shodhak Samaj, the truth-seeking society. So to seek the truth was what was equally important, the truth about existence, not just the wrong that was injustice, the wrong that was birth-based inequality, but you commit yourself to another way of being as such. And that meant that you advanced towards a certain truth, which required you to reflect, think, argue, fight using ideas and words, but not through acts of violence. So I think there was that. And at that time, I was reading Gandhi as well, because you cannot read the history of modern India in any part of the subcontinent without reading Gandhi. And because Ramasamy Periyar was an early admirer of Gandhi, and then he fell out with him over the years. So my colleague and I, Rajadurai, who co-authored this work with me, we read a lot of Gandhi at that time. And it struck me then, and it strikes me now as well when I recall those days, that it's impossible not to sort of start thinking of Ahimsa in a very, let me put it this way, at the risk of sounding puerile, that you cannot escape thinking about Ahimsa when you read Gandhi. It's such a bind on you, right? So at the same time, you also get frustrated because there are other things that you sort of find problematic about Gandhi. But then with this whole Ahimsa thing, you feel there is something here which you can't just let go. So there was that as well. So this was how I personally started thinking of, along with my feminist politics, how Ahimsa, nonviolence are values that one can't take too lightly. And I particularly liked Gandhi's admission in a letter to somebody, I forget who, where someone asks him about forbearance. And he says, when you see me write in Young India, when you hear me speak, you think what a fine old man this is. You think of the person Rome Roland has conjured up for you. But only I know how much effort it takes to maintain this sense of decorum and control and keep my anger at bay. So I think this whole idea of Ahimsa as learned effort, this is something that I found very valuable. And it's of course very difficult to practice. All of us struggle with it every day of our lives, I'm sure. But it also gives you hope that it's not something that you can sort of veer towards, as it were. You have to keep working at it. So, and I think that was very useful.
Yeah.
And then over the years, I've been reading Ambedkar, largely from the work that I started on the Tamil anti-caste movements in the 90s. And what struck me about Ambedkar was the absolute clarity of his vision. And that he didn't come to questions of justice, wrong, the structural violence of the caste order as he understood it. He didn't come to this simply via his own experience of inhumanity or of inequality. Of course, experience is the bedrock on which you build many things. But rarely does he talk about what was it like for him to grow up as a so-called untouchable person. He does refer to it in a couple of places, in an autobiographical essay that he wrote called Waiting for a Visa, but also in a couple of speeches he talks about what it was being discriminated at school and college and so on. But I think what I found very valuable was that from that experience of marginality, of complete sort of being placed outside the pale of the social, so to speak, what he wanted was not to just fight for his place in the social world as he saw it, but to actually rethink the nature of society itself and reconstruct it on the basis of the values that he always felt were the most important ones any society ought to be measured by, which are the values of equality, liberty, and fraternity. And of these three values for Ambedkar, I suspect fraternity was the most important. Because I think also if you go back and look at his education, his days in Columbia, and he was a great admirer of the American philosopher John Dewey. And Dewey is very, and the others who were part of the so-called progressive circle, as they were called in the United States, all of whom felt society is that in which you and another person mutually recognize and value each other. So society is impossible in the singular. And if it has to be possible, then fraternity is the absolute minimum necessary basis for it. So nothing can be a social space unless it's fraternal. And I think for Ambedkar, that meant a great deal. And the way he invokes fraternity in his writings is very, very interesting. At one point, he quotes the Apostle Paul, and he says, Paul sort of constructs this fraternity of the faithful in Christ. And that is through the invocation of a community. Then he quotes the Pilgrim Fathers when they land in the United States, what would become the United States, how they were held together by a covenant. So clearly for him, to fight caste, to fight birth-based inequality, to fight untouchability meant that you remake society on a fraternal basis, where equality and justice and freedom are available to all of us in equal measure. So I think that was a very important value for him. And it must have been very difficult to sort of insist on norms and values as central to remaking the social order when there are so many other expedient ways of fighting this violence called caste. But I think here we need to look at how Ambedkar understood this violence.
Okay.
And I think this is very, very important. And he was a student of caste society all his life, and he differentiated between the caste order and untouchability. He pointed out that they were related, but they are not the same.
Geetha, when you say caste order here, can we understand that as varnashram? Are you using that interchangeably, the term?
To a certain extent, but as you know, as sociologists of Indian society will also tell us, you have this framework of the four varnas, Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra. But this is like a template, right? And you apply this template to the enormous number of jatis or castes that you find in India. And castes also do this themselves. They sort of aspire to one of the other, or the other of the four varnas. I mean, no one aspires to be a Shudra, but people do sort of like to see themselves as belonging to one of the other three varnas. But in reality, you have in India what's called the Varna Jati complex. So when I mean the Indian social order, I mean that. Right. But I think more than the actual empirical details of the social order, following Ambedkar, I would like to point to its logic, its structure, you know. However we understand it, whether these four divisions are paramount and everything can be packed into it, or these other empirical jatis are far more important in considerations of dominance or subordination in particular contexts, you know, however you think about it. The logic of it is what Ambedkar tried to understand. What does it mean to be in this society where you're graded? You're graded in some fashion. So Ambedkar sort of came up with a very brilliant definition of what is it that characterizes this caste order. And he called it the logic of graded inequality. So he said most societies know inequality. You have rich and poor, you have king and commoner, you know, you have the nobles and you have the working class. But in India, you have something more. Indian society is structured like a triangle, which means that no one level of the social order can consider itself equal to any other level. And he understood the caste order as being particularly pernicious because he said, to quote him, that as you go up the caste ladder, imagining for a moment the triangle to be a ladder, if you go up the caste ladder, you experience an ascending scale of reverence. And when you come down the caste order, you experience a descending scale of contempt or humiliation. So basically, his argument was no caste, no varna in the caste order can claim that it is fully human in itself. Its humanity depends on being above someone else and below someone else. So you look up to someone, maybe in a spirit of jealousy, maybe in a spirit of worship, anger, hatred, but you also look down on someone else. So you want to stay where you are. Maybe you like to be kicked up, but you certainly don't want to be kicked down. So this does not make for a good sense of the self. This makes for an extremely scarred sense of the self, which is why Ambedkar felt that how do you negotiate with disorder? There can be no negotiation. One has to exit it completely. And this is as far as the caste order goes. But he felt that untouchables, those who are deemed untouchables in India, traditionally, historically, he argued, some people agree with him, some others don't, but let's stay with his arguments for now. He felt that untouchability was particularly cruel and violent because untouchables were placed outside this triangle, right? So they were not even subject to this graded logic, but they were subject to a logic of utter separation, right? So utter separation meant that you could not hope to be considered human by even the lowest segment within the caste order. So it was everybody inside the caste order and the untouchables. And this is how he defines untouchability. And he speaks of it in very poignant terms, quoting a rather sort of cantankerous orthodox person who defines untouchability in the following way, that the relationship of the untouchable to the rest of society is like that of the foot to the shoe. The foot can do without the shoe, but the shoe cannot do without the foot. The shoe acquires meaning only by being attached to the foot. And for Ambedkar, this was both an ironic and a violent sort of way of characterizing those who are deemed untouchables, that they don't exist as human persons except in the relationship of untouchability, And this he felt was an extremely violent construction of the untouchable. But he did something very important with this understanding. He quickly sort of turned the question around and he said, that being the case, the untouchable is to be placed outside. And if the untouchable's utter degradation is what caste society requires for them to sort of keep the untouchable separate from themselves, what does this tell you of caste society, right? So he says, untouchability is not the untouchables' problems, it is a caste Hindu's problem. So he turned it very neatly the other way around, basically saying, look at yourselves. What are you doing? By deeming someone untouchable, what are you saying? What are you doing? What does it say about yourself? And he gives a number of examples where untouchability is practiced to say, this is so small-minded, this expresses a sense of lack in you, not in me.
Yeah. So in a sense, he is, I also want to ask you how much or how different this is from Gandhi also saying that the fundamental moral problem here is for the so-called upper caste, as in a sense as the source of that violence.
Right.
Can you describe how, having understood the situation in this very acute manner and lived it, in what ways does Ambedkar still find answers in non-violence rather than any form of violence to solve it?
Right. I'm glad you brought up Gandhi, because Gandhi also constantly exhorted caste Hindus to think on this question and to repent and to feel remorse and so on. Ambedkar was very skeptical if that was possible at all, because his understanding was untouchability was mandated by the Hindu religion. Gandhi, of course, would disagree on that score with him. But Ambedkar's argument was that this is mandated by religion. No other religion has sacralized inequality Hinduism has. So for him, therefore, it was impossible to stay a Hindu and not stay outside the caste order, right? And stay outside the caste order. So he didn't think you could fight untouchability if you remained a Hindu. Gandhi, of course, would have disagreed with him completely. Ambedkar's understanding of this being the situation, because then the whole idea of caste-based inequality and untouchability is not so much that the structure, whether it's based on economics, whether it's based on culture, on religion, whatever it is based on, and I guess Ambedkar understood it as being based on all of this.
Yeah.
But the problem is, what he felt had to be grasped was, at the end of the day, caste feeling or the feeling of treating someone as an untouchable is really a notion. It's an attitude, right? You can't kill it, therefore. It's something that is there in you, which you act out, which informs your being. So how do you kill such things? So it's a monster. He calls it a monster, in some ways. But it's not a monster that's just physical. It's a monster that makes you monstrous. So then how do you then combat it? Which is why I think he placed a great stress on combating it through reason, argument, the law. It is not that he didn't think about violence. This I must say. He did think about violence quite a bit. And here he followed John Dewey's definition of violence, of force. Dewey doesn't use the word force. Violence, he uses the word force, which I think is interesting, because force is still not violence, at least not all the time. Force can be consequential and can produce violence, but force is in itself, it can still be considered bracketed, a bracketed term. So Dewey said you need to distinguish between force as destruction and force as energy. And to Ambedkar, that definition was very important in his attempts to understand non-violence and violence, the efficacy of either. So, and this is something that he started thinking about from when he was very young. In 1918, he had to review a book by Bertrand Russell on pacifism. And he talks of how Russell doesn't confuse pacifism with being quiescent. And this is something Indians should take seriously, because Indians think that they have a culture of tolerance, they have a culture of quietism, and that itself is pacifism. But that's not pacifism really, because you need to distinguish between using force to fight a brute form of injustice and being very aware that having used force and successfully conquered injustice, you don't retain force for all times. This was very important for Ambedkar. The way he understood the beginnings of World War II were also precisely along these lines. That World War II happened because of an unjust peace which was dictated to the Germans. You know, anyone who resorts to violence, and Ambedkar allows, there are situations where you will have to do that. Brute force sometimes will not leave you with any choice. And he quarrels with Gandhi's notion of offering satyagraha to Hitler, which he counsels to the British and to the Indians as well, should Germany or Japan invade India. So he said, I don't think that's going to work. First of all, it's not going to be efficacious. And secondly, in some situations, brute force will not allow you any other option but to counter it using brute force. But then he immediately qualifies it by saying, but the thing is, once you've used force to quell a brute power, then the onus is on you to immediately step back and ask yourself, how are you going to ensure justice after this? And for the ensuring of that justice, that you don't use force.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting moral position he takes.
Right. And this would be because his fundamental preoccupation, if I understand correctly, is to seek the means to build the good society for all, which, as you said earlier, is basically the creation and nurturing of fraternal relations.
Yes. To an extent, I think, yeah, he would put it this way: the use of force as destruction, it simply does not achieve one single end. If your intent is to sort of win over fascism, let's say, it's not just fascism you destroy a great many other things as well. So for him, the question was, how do you square means and ends? The same question that Gandhi was concerned with. And of course, if not the ends, what else will justify the means? But for him, non-violence was a means. It was not the end like it was for Gandhi. Just as how violence was a means. But having said that, and to come back to your question, what made violence or non-violence possible in any situation was the situation itself. So for him, the choice was dictated by the circumstances in which you encounter violence. Now, the reason why he didn't want violence against caste was, obviously, if it's a notion, if it's a mental habit, if it's something that inheres in your understanding of the world, you can't kill it through violence.
No.
So, and he wanted to, whatever force you use to challenge caste, whether it's the force of law, whether it's a diktat of the state, that form of force should be force as energy, as something that produces a consequential good, and not simply that's punitive. And even if it is punitive, and he would say this later on in his book, his magnum opus, The Buddha and his Dhamma, quoting the Buddha himself, that Buddha does not disapprove of the magistrate. He does not disapprove of dispensing justice. After all, he knew many kings. But he felt that the dispenser of justice should do so without bitterness or hatred. So I think that was important for him. So therefore, when he sort of felt that even if you were to use violence, you must step back, it was because in caste society at least, the violence was not going to be violence in terms of acts of violence. It might be more the force of law, rules of the state and so on, which may not be to the liking of everyone, but it has to be done. At the same time, you have to use it in such a way that you communicate the intent for which you are using it. That it is to build a good society, to build a fraternal social order, to sort of imbue those who haven't thought about these matters with a sense of remorse, you know. And I remember this very interesting speech he makes in the Rajya Sabha, the upper house of Indian Parliament, in 1953 or 54, where Parliament has to sort of discuss this report filed by the Commissioner for the Scheduled Caste. That's what the Dalits were called as after that in the 50s. And Ambedkar, while commenting on the report, he says, what I find missing in this report, apart from facts, etc., is that there is no sense of communicating the weight and gravity of what we are fighting. If we don't do that, you're not going to induce a quickening of public conscience. So for him, even the force of law had to do that. It had to quicken public conscience. So it is only through conscience, it's only through wanting to relate to the former untouchable, to those that have been at the other end of the caste order, a recognition of their suffering and your endurance and your striving to be human. Those were the things that mattered to him. Ultimately, of course, he was a great pragmatist in the philosophical sense. He wanted law to be effective. He wanted the Constitution of India to be meaningful. But to what purpose? The purpose was this, that you become a more humane person and that you recognize the suffering that you've caused. And the Dalits, the untouchables, so-called untouchables, and those who are at the receiving end of the caste order, find their humanity recognized and affirmed. That was important.
This context, Geetha, to what extent is the conversion to the Dhamma, the Buddhist Dhamma, telling us that, because the crux of the Buddhist faith is Maitri. And is it then when Baba Sahib embraces Buddhism, is this a way of saying that there can be no Maitri without Ahimsa? Am I making too large a connection there?
I think Ambedkar retains his ambiguity about violence and non-violence as means to some extent, even in the Buddha and his Dhamma. But I think his choice of Buddhism is very, very interesting because I think it's a very complicated and long story why he decides to convert, and I won't have time to go into it. But I think basically, and I always say this when I sort of do this set of classes with whoever wants me to, where I call it Let's Read Ambedkar, which is that think of a man who has sort of charted out in front of him 6 or 8 ways to walk, to attain a certain goal, but you have only 2 legs. So how do you walk those 8 ways, and those 8 ways are not going to be navigable in exactly the same speed. The consequences are going to be very different. So I think for Ambedkar, having walked many of these paths, halfway, quarter way, full way, the Buddha's Dhamma, Sadhamma, became a path that he felt one could walk longer than others. Because I think it sort of held within itself the core of everything else that he found very valuable. So if you were to take his interest in equality, for example, the Buddha, of course, as we know, was the supreme apostle of equality in the sense that he was completely set against birth-based superiority. And the Buddha sort of, the Sangha was home to everyone from women of the royal family to women who sort of were from different social strata, to those who were considered outside the pale of the social order, to low caste, so-called low caste, people who wanted to become bhikkhus. So Ambedkar found that equality was the core of the Buddha's Dhamma. And of course, because the Buddha was not interested in disquisitions about the soul or God and so on, the mind was left free to explore the nature of the universe, of the social universe. So I think for Ambedkar, the attraction of Buddhism was that it's about the relationship of human beings to each other, not about human beings and God. So how are we going to treat each other? How are we going to live with each other? See, the thing is, that's where fraternity becomes important. It's not simply that I want justice. With justice, how are we going to live with each other? We have to. It's a choiceless mandate, because that is what makes society possible. And Ambedkar desired fraternity. Fraternity was a desired ideal. It's a very poignant desire coming from the position that society had subjected him to, from that position of abjection. To desire fraternity is an enormously generous and critical worldview. Whether it's Maitri. And so I think the Buddha's notion of Maitri, and Ambedkar glosses it very nicely. He says it's not simply the idea of fellowship with human beings, but with all of the creation. It's not simply human beings, it is all of creation. So Maitri is potentially endlessly expansive. It connects you further and further with the universe. And if you combine that with what else Buddhism says, that nothing is given, everything changes, and the whole notion of sunyata, that there is nothing really rock bottom except change. And Ambedkar makes that a positive principle, saying that being is eternally becoming. So you constantly work at it. And the whole idea of shunyata means then you start afresh each time.
Yes.
So there's no room for diffidence or no room for cynicism. And Maitri alone is what remains given within the Buddhist universe. Sadhamma is premised on Maitri, and Ambedkar beautifully puts it. He says, Karuna is, of course, very important. Karuna is compassion. But he says, greater than Karuna is Maitri.
Mm.
It's one step above Karuna, because it's not simply compassion, it's fellowship.
Yes.
It's where we actively desire to be together in equality, mutuality, and respect. So I think, and to be there requires constant striving, constant working, and his conversion to Buddhism signaled his readiness to leave what he thought was a very cruel social order, what essentially is a very cruel social order, to one that was grounded in compassion, maitri, and fellow feeling. And he felt it was important to do this because he, having worked at the Indian Constitution, having been in the Legislative Assembly, he still felt the law can do so much. And as he very memorably put it in 1928, when he had to depose before the British Commission for Political Reform, and the British asked him, you're asking for these political guarantees for the so-called untouchables. Do you think this will improve their station in life? Do you think this will make them more acceptable in Indian society? And he puts it so poignantly. He says, I cannot make a man love his neighbor through an act of legislature. And that feeling stayed with him all his life. When he felt the necessity of the law, necessity of constitutional morality, he felt morality itself has to rest on what he understood as religion. So he was not opposed to thinking about religion. And when he talks of religion, he talks of it using a capital R, It's like it denotes an area of human experience.
Yeah.
And it's not this religion or that religion. And he felt not all religions were the same. And he chose Buddhism consciously over other religions because the act of conversion was a huge rite of passage. It was leaving behind a certain way of being and becoming another being, so to speak. So I think that conversion marks a passage from graded inequality to fraternity, if you were to understand it that way. And Ahimsa becomes important there because if you have to stay fraternal, if you have to take in seriously that greater than Karuna is Maitri, then you will constantly have to work at justice on the one hand and Maitri on the other. Yeah. Which is why he has his Buddha say, the Buddha was for justice, but for justice without bitterness or hatred. Mm-hmm. And I think this was what Ambedkar was striving for.
Yeah. So Geetha, in closing, you've actually laid it out very clearly, but still I would ask that, could you now, in closing, sum up what young people today who are keen to see positive and progressive change, but feel daunted, they feel somewhat overwhelmed by the proliferation of hatred and to a large extent the legitimization of violence in everyday life and at the political level. Because you have, I know, a lot of experience on the ground, both from your work as a feminist and as an activist on caste issues. What are some of the key doable things that you would offer or you would suggest to young people?
I'm going to be very cheesy first and quote a line from one of my favorite poets, W.H. Auden. He himself at some point in life disowned this line. But I think it's a good cheesy line to keep in mind. We should love each other or die. This is what he says in 1939 on the eve of fascism. Though he, of course, felt that was cheesy later on. But I still think that's a very powerful kind of idea, that we have to choicelessly live with each other and love each other. And love is an imperative in that sense. And for me, it's important to keep this in mind. And I learned it from another school of pacifism, that of the African Americans. Martin Luther King and his tradition, because I remember listening to this fantastic African American sociologist, George Lipsitz, who's one of those very rare people. He's an African American Jewish person. It's a very rare sort of history that is. And I remember he came to this conference and he just stood up and he said, I'm going to talk to you about love. And the way he said it, so unself-consciously, and he was talking about the after effects of building society in New Orleans post-Katrina, the great horrible tornado. That he said this while talking about the reconstruction efforts in New Orleans after the tornado Katrina had leveled the place down. And he spoke of how Vietnamese Americans and African Americans worked together to ensure some modicum of mindful social coming together and so on. So I think to keep that in mind is very important, that at the risk of sounding sentimental, we must still sort of hold on to the fact we can and must love each other. There's no running away from that fact, however difficult it is. And like Gandhi, I believe it's a schooled emotion. You have to build yourself into that position. And Ambedkar also, I think, for all the stuff he said about force, and he even talks of hatred sometimes. He says, I hate cant, I hate hypocrisy, I hate people with these views, but you must understand my hatred is a reflex of the things I love. So, and I think in that sense, for young people, it might be interesting to think of why we are against some things and we are against many wrong things today, but how we must never forget that's the reflex of what we want in their place, which is really not hatred, therefore love, which is not violence, therefore fellowship. And once we keep telling ourselves that, then we don't get cynical. And I think for me, the most important lesson I take from Ambedkar's life is that he never allowed cynicism or doubt to sort of intrude in his vision. He was unhappy, he felt alone, he felt cornered, all of that. But he remained very committed to that vision of democracy, justice, and fraternity. So that's something that one can keep in mind. And secondly, think of our fellow citizens, those we consider resourceless, those we consider the very poor and the very oppressed. They are the ones who set standards for fighting injustice. And how do they do that? Not just through protests, but the way they take the law of this land seriously. They take the constitution seriously. There are 150 times that they're willing to climb the stairs of the local court to again depose before a judge. The 25th time that they don't mind telling you the story of what happened to them. Where does that come from? A deep faith that we as a people have built something together, given ourselves these common and just laws, and those laws should and must protect me, And for me, that's a very humbling experience, watching a scheduled, a tribal person, an Adivasi person, a Dalit woman, work with the courts, protest again, civilly, non-violently, for something she wants. And again, they remind us we have no right to be cynical, we have no right to feel hopeless. We can, of course, despair, we can feel angst, as all of us do, but that's a different matter. But to take faith and courage from those who have taken faith and courage from Baba Sahib, from others like him. And I think Ambedkar, for me, stands for that spirit of enormous faith in the possibilities of a reconstructed world. And he didn't let anything stop that vision from becoming real for him. And his conversion must be seen as a point of departure, not as a point of arrival, It's a point of departure towards, as he said, reconstructing the world, so to speak. So that's what I would sort of, and one thing is to talk, to reason out things, to argue, to be civil with our differences, not to polarize ourselves, and to not to think any question too stupid or too humble, for us to address. And this is something we should learn from Gandhi, who never found any query foolish, whether it was, a child that asked that question or an adult. So I think these are things that we must take seriously to heart. And I say this because we're all on the brink of feeling despondent, feeling really sort of wondering where the world is going. And all these are very real feelings. And I think what we can learn from history, from these amazing human beings who've left behind such a legacy of ideas, is that what sustained them was the sense of Maitri, and the sense that to get there, violence and unjust means are not the way at all. So that's what I would end with, Rajni.
Thank you so much, Geetha.
Thank you for having me on this talk. It's always nice to be connected to Gandhi's idea of Ahimsa, one way or the other.